Hey guys, if you enjoy this kind of long video, please subscribe now. It really helps me upload new videos every day.
The heroin craze of 1920s Paris. Go ahead and find a comfortable spot, dim those lights, and maybe grab a warm drink. Tonight, we're going to drift back to a time that was supposedly roaring, but for many, it was more of a slow, hazy stumble. We're talking about Paris in the 1920s, the NA's foal, and the rather peculiar, tragic, and deeply messy relationship the city's elite had with a new little substance called heroin. So just settle in, relax, and let's float over to the damp, flickering streets of Montmartre to see how it all went wrong. Now, if you were a wealthy socialite in 1920 Paris, you probably thought you were the pinnacle of human achievement. The Great War was over, the jazz was loud, and everyone was desperate to forget that the world had almost ended. And what better way to forget than by indulging in a bit of pharmaceutical courage? At the time, heroin wasn't exactly the back-alley boogeyman we think of today. It was more like the trendy, slightly dangerous cousin of aspirin that you could pick up because, well, why not? Let's start with the atmosphere. Imagine a smoky cafe, the kind where Ernest Hemingway is probably brooding in a corner about a fish, and the air is thick with the smell of expensive perfume and cheap tobacco. In these circles, heroin was often referred to as la joyeuse, or the joyful one. A bit ironic, considering it usually ended with people staring at a wall for 6 hours, but irony was very fashionable in the 20s. The French elite, particularly the lost generation of artists and writers, treated their bodies like chemistry sets. Take, for instance, the Count Jean Cocteau. Now, Jean was the ultimate Parisian multi-hyphenate, poet, filmmaker, professional socialite, and a man who never met a trend he didn't want to overdo. He didn't just try substances, he curated them. For Jean and his circle, the transition from opium to heroin was less of a moral failing and more of a tech upgrade. Opium was slow, bulky, and required a whole kit of pipes and lamps. It was very Victorian. Heroin? Heroin was modern. It was fast. It was the flapper of drugs. But of course, because this is a royal and elite disaster story, no one actually knew what they were doing. They would host white dinners where the decor was white, the clothes were white, and the tiny porcelain dishes featured a certain white powder. It was all very aesthetic until everyone realized they couldn't actually hold a conversation or, stand up. Let's drift over to the medical experts of the day, because of course the doctors were involved. In the early 20s, some French physicians actually prescribed heroin as a cure for morphine addiction. It's the classic historical move. I see you have a fire in your kitchen. Have you tried putting it out with this slightly larger fire from the living room? It was a cycle of cures that just led to more expensive problems. The tragic part, well, the most tragic part, since this entire era was a slow-motion car crash, was how it hit the young heirs of the Great War. You have these incredibly wealthy, deeply bored, and slightly shell-shocked young men and women wandering around the Rive Gauche. They had all the money in the world and absolutely no sense of self-preservation. They would spend their afternoons in nursing homes that were essentially just high-end hotels where you could recover from your nervous exhaustion, read overdose, while being served tea by a nurse who was probably also on something. Then there were the heroin parties hosted by people like the Marquise de Polignac. These weren't the wild dancing-on-tables parties you see in movies. They were quiet, uncomfortably quiet. Just a room full of the most powerful people in France, sitting in velvet armchairs, slowly nodding off while a gramophone played the same record over and over. It was the birth of the cool, but it was a cold, sickly kind of cool. The authorities eventually caught on, of course. By 1922 and 1923, the French police started realizing that their poets were falling over in the streets a bit too often. They began raiding the laboratories hidden in the basements of Montmartre laundries. But the elite just moved their habits behind closed doors into the gilded salons of the 16th arrondissement. They felt they were above the law because, in their minds, a gentleman or a lady couldn't possibly be a common addict. They were just experimenting with the limits of the soul. It was a delicate, disastrous dance. One week, you're the toast of Paris, attending a premiere at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, and the next, you're selling your family's heirloom emeralds because your habit has become more expensive than your mortgage. It was a descent into a very pretty, very expensive fog.
Okay, let's just gently ease back into the hazy, smoky, slightly tragic world of 1920s Paris. We've set the scene, painted a picture of the casual indulgence among the elite, and now it's time to delve a little deeper into the personal stories, because that's where the real sleepy time drama unfolds. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with someone who truly embodied the era's blend of artistic genius, reckless abandon, and, ultimately, the sad grip of addiction. We're talking about none other than Raymond Radiguet. Now, if you haven't heard of Raymond, don't worry, you're in for a treat. He was one of those literary prodigies who burned incredibly bright, and then, because this is a sleepless historian monologue, burned out far too quickly. Raymond was practically a child when he became a sensation. He wrote his most famous novel, Le Diable au corps, literally The Devil in the Flesh, when he was 17. 17! Most of us at 17 were struggling with algebra, not crafting modernist masterpieces that scandalized Parisian society. The book was a sensation, partly because it was incredibly well written, and partly because it was about a scandalous affair between a young man and an older married woman during World War I. Very French, very controversial, very much the kind of thing that would get you invited to all the right parties. And that's where our story takes a turn into the predictable. Raymond, this brilliant, precocious teenager, found himself embraced by the very circles we were just discussing, the same ones where little white powders were passed around like after-dinner mints. He became a protégé, a darling, a pet project of none other than Jean Cocteau. And Cocteau, as we know, was not exactly a beacon of sobriety. He was more like a lighthouse that guided ships directly onto very exciting but ultimately destructive rocks. Cocteau, with his magnetic personality and his rather indulgent lifestyle, introduced Raymond to everything Paris had to offer, including, of course, heroin. Now, Raymond was young, impressionable, and probably felt invincible, as most incredibly talented young people do. The idea of experimenting with La Joyeuse probably seemed like just another artistic exploration, another way to push boundaries and feel deeply, profoundly modern. After all, if the celebrated older artists were doing it, why shouldn't he? The problem, as it so often is, was that Raymond wasn't a hardened veteran of self-destruction. He was a fragile genius, and heroin hit him hard and fast. His life, which had been a whirlwind of writing, intellectual sparring, and social triumph, began to unravel with a quiet, sickening inevitability. His health, which was never robust to begin with, started to decline. The creative energy that had propelled him to literary stardom began to dissipate, replaced by the dull, relentless demands of addiction. His friends, particularly Cocteau, were complicit in a very Parisian way. They weren't actively trying to hurt him, of course. They just saw it as part of the Bohemian lifestyle, an unfortunate but almost romantic byproduct of genius. They would try to detox him, which usually involved taking him to a secluded villa outside Paris, giving him some kind of sedative, and then watching him shake and sweat for a few days before he inevitably slipped back into his old habits the moment they returned to the city. It was a well-meaning but ultimately ineffective cycle, like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. The stories from those years are laced with a sort of morbid glamour. Radiguet, this young, handsome, brilliant poet, would be seen wandering the streets, his eyes glazed, his usually sharp wit replaced by a quiet intensity that was more disturbing than charming. He would write in fits and starts, his once prolific output slowing to a trickle. The spark that had so captivated Paris was flickering, getting dimmer with each passing month. And then, as is the cruel twist of fate in so many of these stories, tragedy struck, not directly from Heroine, but from a related vulnerability. In December 1923, Raymond contracted typhoid fever. Now, typhoid itself was serious, but for someone whose body had been ravaged by addiction, whose immune system was likely in tatters, it was a death sentence. He had no reserves, no strength left to fight. He died on December 12, 1923, at the shockingly young age of 20. 20! Just imagine. He had written 2 groundbreaking novels, lived a lifetime of experience, and then simply faded away, another casualty of the indulgent, self-destructive era. Cocteau, who had been both his mentor and arguably an enabler, was devastated. He famously said, "I have lost my hope, my right arm." Then he promptly fell deeper into his own addiction, a testament to the fact that grief and guilt often fuel the very habits they should cure. Raymond Radiguet's death became a grim wake-up call for some in Paris, a stark reminder that La Joyeuse wasn't always so joyful. But for many others, it was just a sad footnote. Another young genius who burned too brightly and went out too soon. The parties continued, the powders continued to circulate, and the lessons, as they often are in history, were only learned by a select few and then promptly forgotten by the next generation. His story is a quiet tragedy, not filled with dramatic screams, but with the slow, almost imperceptible decline of a brilliant mind. It's a testament to the seductive power of novelty and the destructive force of unchecked indulgence, all set against the backdrop of a city that was trying desperately to forget its past, and in doing so, stumbled into a different kind of darkness.
The gilded decline of the salon addicts. So we've looked at the tragic, flickering light of Raymond Radiguet, but let's float a little further down the Seine, shall we? Because the thing about 1920s Paris was that it wasn't just the starving artists or the young geniuses getting lost in the fog. No, the white madness reached all the way into the highest, most ridiculous tiers of the aristocracy. These were people with titles that dated back to the Crusades and bank accounts that could buy entire city blocks. Yet they found themselves completely undone by a little bit of powder and a lot of boredom. Let's talk about the environment of the salon. Now, in history books, salons are often portrayed as these dignified intellectual hubs where people discussed philosophy and the future of democracy. But by the mid-1920s, some of the more exclusive salons in the Faubourg Saint-Germain had turned into something, well, a bit more pathetic. Imagine a room filled with Louis XIV furniture, priceless tapestries, and people who literally forgot how to blink. In these circles, there was a certain etiquette to addiction. You didn't just do drugs. That sounds so common, doesn't it? Instead, you had the vapors, or a delicate constitution. It became fashionable to look sickly, the heroine look, pale skin, dark circles under the eyes, a certain skeletal chic was actually sought after. If you looked healthy and sun-kissed, people might think you'd been spending time outdoors like a peasant, and we couldn't have that. One of the most ironical figures of this time was the Princess de Polignac, not the famous Winneretta, but the wider circle of socialites who surrounded her. They lived in a world where every whim was catered to, yet they were profoundly, existentially bored. When you have everything, what do you do next? Apparently, you see how long you can stare at a single chandelier crystal without moving.
The dealers for these elites weren't hooded figures in dark alleys. Often they were chemists who made house calls. There's something darkly funny about a man in a tuxedo arriving at a mansion, being greeted by a butler, and then heading upstairs to consult with the count, only to leave 20 minutes later with a pocket full of francs. It was a very organized, very polite catastrophe. But of course, the money eventually starts to run thin, even for the upper crust. Let's look at the Habsburg potato types, those minor royals who moved to Paris after their own empires collapsed following the war. They had the titles, they had the ego, but they didn't have the steady income anymore. These displaced royals became some of the most tragic figures of the heroine craze. They were trying to maintain a lifestyle of champagne and silk, while their actual reality was pawning their grandmother's diamond tiaras to pay for their next medical treatment. There's a story, likely a bit exaggerated, but very much in the spirit of the time, of a Russian Grand Duke who had fled the revolution and ended up in a tiny, drafty apartment in Paris. He would sit in his moth-eaten military uniform, surrounded by empty heroin vials, insisting that the Tsar was going to call him back any day now. He was living in a dream world within a dream world. It's that ironic contrast again, the highest of births meeting the lowest of habits. And what about the women of this era? The flappers are often remembered for their liberation, shorter skirts, bobbed hair, and the right to vote. But for the elite women of Paris, heroin was often a trap disguised as a trend. They were told it would help them stay thin, which it did in the most horrifying way possible, and that it would give them a mysterious aura. Instead of liberation, many found themselves in a state of permanent lethargy. They would miss their own parties, or worse, show up and fall asleep in the soup. There are accounts of hostesses who were so indisposed that their servants had to basically prop them up like mannequins to greet guests. "Oh, don't mind the Duchess," they'd say. "She's just having one of her episodes." The dry humor of the situation, if you can call it that, was how the socialites tried to outdo each other with their recovery stories. It became a competition. "Oh, I spent 3 weeks in a sanatorium in Switzerland," one would brag. "Well," another would reply, "I spent 6 weeks in a private clinic in the Black Forest, and I had a personal nurse who only spoke in whispers." It was all a performance. The cure was just a temporary pause before the next season's parties began. By the mid-1920s, the French government finally started to get its act together. They passed the Act of 1922, which significantly tightened the rules on narcotics. But the elite, in their usual rules are for other people fashion, just got more creative. They started using couriers, often young, desperate artists or struggling actors, to transport the goods. It was a hierarchy of misery. The wealthy stayed in their mansions, while the poor took the risks. As we drift further into the late 20s, the mood starts to shift. The haze is lifting, but what it reveals isn't pretty. The Great Depression is looming on the horizon, and the roaring 20s are starting to sound more like a wheeze. The people who survived the heroin craze were left with shattered health and empty bank accounts. The irony is that they spent a decade trying to escape the trauma of one war, only to end up completely unprepared for the economic and political disasters of the next decade. It was a slow, gilded decline. No one woke up one morning and decided to ruin their life. They just drifted into it, one joyful dose at a time, convinced that they were too important, too rich, or too talented to ever truly fall. But as history shows us, gravity doesn't care about your title.
The gray morning after the white night. So, here we are, drifting into the late 1920s. If the beginning of the decade was a shimmering golden haze, the end was more like a damp, gray Tuesday morning in a Paris gutter. The party was winding down, not because people wanted to go home, but because the lights were flickering and the host had run out of money. This is the part of our story where the glamour of the heroin craze finally meets the cold, hard pavement of reality. And as you can probably guess, it wasn't a soft landing. Let's talk about the Great Crash. Not just the one on Wall Street in 1929, though that certainly didn't help the Parisian socialites, but the personal crashes that were happening in every gilded apartment from the Place Vendôme to the Bois de Boulogne. By 1928, the fashionable side of addiction had started to look, well, quite unfashionable. The skeletal look that was so chic a few years prior was now just looking like what it actually was, a slow-motion disappearance. The casual snark of the era began to turn into a bitter sort of irony. The elites who had joked about their pharmaceutical courage were now facing a city that was rapidly losing interest in their antics. The public mood in France was shifting. People were tired of the excesses of the années folles. There was a growing sense that while the veterans of the Great War were struggling for bread, the bright young things were wasting their fortunes on a slow-motion suicide. Take a look at the heroin hotels. These were establishments that had once looked the other way for a hefty tip, but by the end of the decade, they were being raided with a new aggressive regularity. The police, led by the increasingly frustrated prefecture of police, were no longer charmed by a title or a famous last name. There's a rather pathetic account of a certain baron, whose name we shall omit to save his descendants some embarrassment, who tried to hide his stash inside a hollowed-out bust of Napoleon. When the police found it, he allegedly tried to claim it was historical dust, because, of course, why not double down on the absurdity when you're about to be hauled off to the station? But the real decline wasn't in the arrests, it was in the silence. The salons we talked about earlier? They were getting quieter. Not the peaceful, meditative quiet of a good nap, but the heavy, oppressive silence of a room where half the guests are too sick to speak and the other half are wondering where their next dose is coming from. The white dinners had lost their luster. The white decor now just looked clinical, like a hospital ward where everyone had forgotten to bring the medicine. Let's float over to the tragic end of the Lost Generations experiment. By the turn of the decade, many of the writers and artists who had survived the initial craze were looking for a way out. Some, like Jean Cocteau, eventually checked themselves into actual clinics, not the fancy rest homes of the early 20s, but places with locked doors and very little velvet. Cocteau's recovery was a long, painful process that he documented in his book Opium, which, despite the title, covers his struggle with the whole spectrum of substances. He described the process as a wound in slow motion. And then there was the economic reality. The American expatriates, the Hemingways and Fitzgeralds, were seeing their exchange rates crumbling. The cheap Parisian life was no longer cheap. The wealthy socialites who had lived off dividends and family estates found their bank accounts frozen or depleted. When the money for the heroin ran out, the glamour evaporated instantly. It turns out that being a mysterious addict is only possible if you have a staff to clean up after you. Without the maids and the butlers, it was just a messy, desperate struggle in a cold apartment. The irony here is almost too thick to cut. These people had spent 10 years trying to be modern, trying to be ahead of their time, only to realize they had wasted the most productive years of their lives in a chemical fog. As the 1930s dawned, a new aesthetic was taking over, one of strength, athleticism, and political conviction. The pale, trembling heroin user was suddenly a relic of a past that everyone wanted to forget. They went from being the vanguard of culture to being a source of national embarrassment. The craze didn't end with a bang or a grand legislative victory. It just sort of dissolved. The heroin didn't go away, of course. It just moved back into the shadows where it came from. It left the salons and returned to the back alleys. The elites who survived it were left as ghosts of the 20s. You'd see them in the 1930s, sitting in the back of cafes, looking older than their years, their skin like parchment, their hands shaking as they reached for a glass of absinthe, the old-fashioned vice they'd returned to because it was cheaper and more reliable. They were the half-baked potatoes of history, royals and elites who had given every advantage and chose to use them to see how quickly they could fade away.
It's a story of profound boredom and the dangerous delusion that wealth makes you immune to the laws of biology. As we close the book on 1920s Paris, let's take a final look at those flickering streetlights. The jazz has stopped. The flappers have grown up or vanished. The white madness is over, leaving behind a trail of ruined lives and half-written masterpieces. It was a decade that tried to run away from the horror of war and ran straight into a different kind of nightmare, one that was quiet, expensive, and deeply, deeply sleepy.
The bitter aftertaste and the crumbling facade. Welcome back. If you're still with me, you're likely feeling as heavy-lidded as a Parisian count in 1927, which is exactly where we want to be. We've watched the rise of the white joy, we've seen the tragic fall of the boy wonder Raymond Radiguet, and we've peeked behind the velvet curtains of the elite salons. Now, as we move into the final chapters of this particular disaster, we have to look at the wreckage. Because when the fog finally lifts, the view is rarely pretty. It's mostly just expensive furniture covered in dust and a lot of very tired people wondering where their youth went. Let's drift over to the concept of the social ghost. By 1930, Paris was full of them. These were the men and women who had been the literal center of the universe in 1924, but who were now essentially living shadows. They still had their titles, they were still duchesses, princes, and barons, but they were socially dead. In the brutal hierarchy of high society, nothing is less fashionable than a visible decline. It's one thing to be a tragic addict when you're 20 and beautiful. It's quite another when you're 35, your teeth are failing, and you've pawned your last silver fox fur just to pay the chemist. The irony of the Habsburg potato aesthetic we mentioned earlier really hit its peak here. You had these minor royals who had survived the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, moved to Paris to live like kings on a budget, and ended up looking like they had been left in a damp cellar for a decade. They were a walking contrast, wearing a monocle and a tailored coat that was fraying at the sleeves, talking about the good old days in Vienna while waiting for a delivery of powder that would make them forget they were living in a two-room flat. It was a masterpiece of denial. And let's talk about the medical tourism of the late 20s. This was the era of the sanatorium scams. Across Europe, particularly in Switzerland and the French Riviera, clinics popped up that promised to reinvigorate the weary soul. For the Parisian elite, these were essentially high-priced nurseries. They would go there for the cure, which usually involved a lot of mountain air, very bland soup, and, ironically, different types of sedatives to help them with the withdrawal. The doctors at these clinics were often as eccentric as their patients. They'd prescribe electrical baths or vibratory therapy to realign the nerves. It was all very scientific-sounding nonsense designed to separate the wealthy from their remaining francs. You'd have a Russian princess sitting in a bathtub of lukewarm salt water, convinced she was being purified, while just across the hall, a French industrialist was trying to bribe a nurse for a smuggled vial of the very thing he was there to quit. It was a carousel of expensive futility. But why did they keep going? Why double down on the disaster? Well, because for the elite of the 1920s, reality was simply too loud. The Great War had left a ringing in the ears of an entire generation. Heroine didn't just provide a high, it provided a mute button. It turned the chaos of a changing world, a world of rising taxes, crumbling empires, and the terrifying prospect of social equality, into a soft, manageable blur. It was the ultimate luxury, the ability to ignore the future. Let's float over to the tragic case of the forgotten heirs. One of the saddest aspects of this era was what happened to the children of these elite addicts. Imagine being raised in a mansion where your parents are essentially furniture, beautiful, well-dressed furniture that occasionally nods off mid-sentence. These kids were raised by governesses and tutors while their parents recovered in various wings of the house.
By the time these kids reached adulthood in the 30s, they were often just as broken as their parents, but without the benefit of the family fortune, which had been snorted, injected, or pawned away. The dry humor of the era's end can be found in the memoirs written years later. These survivors would write about the charming little parties where everyone was so delightfully tired. They framed their addiction as a poetic choice, a rebellion against the boredom of existence. But if you read between the lines, you see the sarcasm of fate. They thought they were being rebels, but they were actually just the ultimate consumers, buying a product that literally consumed them in return. As we reach the mid-1930s, the Parisian craze had become a cautionary tale whispered in the updated salons. The new generation, the one that would have to face the next Great War, looked back at the 1920s with a mixture of pity and disgust. The heroine cheek was replaced by industrial vigor. The pale, waifish look was out. Tanned skin and athletic builds were in. The ghosts of the 20s were pushed further into the back corners of the cafes, eventually disappearing altogether as the drums of war began to beat again. It's a flat gray ending to a story that started with such a joyful spark. There were no grand trials, no cinematic final stands, just a slow, rhythmic fading away of a group of people who had too much money, too much time, and not enough sense to realize that you can't outrun yourself, no matter how fast your car is or how expensive your powder. They left behind a legacy of modern tragedy, a reminder that even the most gilded life can be tarnished beyond repair by a single trendy mistake. And as the lights finally go out on our 1920s Paris, we can see the city for what it was, a beautiful, sparkling stage where the actors forgot their lines and just decided to take a very long, very expensive nap. I think we've successfully drifted through the haze of Paris. We've seen the glitz, the grit, and the eventual grayness. Your eyes are probably feeling quite heavy now, which is exactly the point. The story of the White Madness is finished, its participants long gone into the annals of weird history.
The final fade and the legacy of the lost. We've reached that quiet hour now, haven't we? The time when the jazz has long since stopped, the champagne bubbles have gone flat, and even the most persistent socialite has finally found their way to bed. As we wrap up our long, hazy wander through the heroin-soaked streets of 1920s Paris, we need to look at what remained once the joyous one finally lost its grip on the city's imagination. Because every party, no matter how expensive or how fueled by pharmaceutical courage, eventually leaves a mess for someone else to clean up. If you're still awake, just let your mind float over the image of a Paris in 1934 or 1935. The roaring 20s were now a decade in the rearview mirror, and the people who survived them were like artifacts in a museum that no one really wanted to visit anymore. The elite addicts who hadn't succumbed to nervous exhaustion or typhoid were now facing a world that was becoming increasingly loud, aggressive, and, worst of all for them, earnest. Let's talk about the ironic survival. There is a certain dry humor in the fact that some of the most dedicated hedonists of the 20s actually lived to be quite old. But it wasn't a victory. They survived as relics. Imagine being a former heroine queen of the 1922 salon scene, now living in a world where people are talking about the Maginot Line and the rise of fascism. You're still wearing your cloche hat and your pearls, but your hands shake a little too much to hold your teacup, and no one remembers the scandalous poem you inspired Jean Cocteau to write. These survivors often became the professional expatriates. They moved from Paris to the cheaper corners of the French Riviera or even over to North Africa, places where the sun was hot enough to warm their thin blood and where the authorities were a bit more relaxed about personal habits. They lived in crumbling villas, surrounded by boxes of old silk dresses and letters from lovers who had died of overexcitement years ago.
It was a slow, sunny decline, a far cry from the flickering gaslights of Montmartre. But what about the cultural stain left behind? This is where the story gets a bit more, well, let's call it productively tragic. The heroine craze of the 20s fundamentally changed how we view the artist. Before this, the suffering artist was usually starving or dying of tuberculosis. After the 1920s, the archetype shifted. The cool, detached, slightly medicated creator became the new standard. The irony is that while the drugs destroyed the individuals, they created a brand of bohemianism that people are still trying to copy today, usually with much less expensive clothes and much better health insurance. The French government, for its part, tried to scrub the era from the record. They wanted to project an image of a strong, healthy republic. They tightened the laws even further, turning the once fashionable pharmacies into strictly regulated fortresses. The casual era of picking up a pick-me-up while you bought your soap was gone. The white madness was officially categorized as a social plague rather than an elite hobby. Of course, the elite didn't just stop having problems, they just changed their solutions. As heroin became too dangerous and socially stigmatized, the upper classes drifted toward barbiturates, and later the cocktail of pills that would define the mid-century. The white powder was replaced by little blue pills. It was the same cycle of escape, just in a different delivery system. The half-baked Habsburg potato types simply traded one fog for another, proving that if you have enough money and enough boredom, you can find a way to avoid reality in any decade. Let's float over one last time to the figure of Jean Cocteau. He's the perfect endnote for our story. Cocteau survived. He lived till 1963. He became a respected member of the Académie Française, but he never truly left the 1920s behind. He spent the rest of his life writing and filming stories about mirrors, dreams, and the thin line between life and death. His addiction wasn't just a phase, it became the texture of his soul. He was the lucky one, the one who could turn his nerves into art. Most of his friends just ended up as footnotes in a police report or names on a shared tomb in Père Lachaise. The dry humor of history is that we now look back at the 1920s as a time of incredible liberation and fun. We watch movies with sparkling dresses and upbeat jazz. We forget the white dinners where no one spoke. We forget the nursing homes full of 20-year-olds with no pulse. We forget that the lost generation wasn't just lost geographically, they were lost in their own chemistry. It's a flat, rhythmic ending to a very bumpy ride. The Parisian heroin craze wasn't a revolution, it was a collective sigh. It was a group of people who had seen too much horror in 1914 and decided that they'd rather not see anything for a while. And in the end, the world just kept moving without them. The cafes were repainted, the music changed to something faster and harsher, and the joyous one retreated back into the shadows, waiting for the next generation of bored elites to rediscover its false promises. As we close this chapter, I want you to imagine the city of Paris finally going to sleep. Not the fitful, drug-induced sleep of 1925, but a deep, natural rest. The ghosts of the counts and the marquises have finally stopped whispering. The white madness has dissolved into the river air. You're safe, you're warm, and the drama of the past is just a story told in a low voice to help you drift away. The 1920s are over. The lights are out. The world is quiet. There's nothing left to do but let the weight of history pull you down into a peaceful, dreamless slumber. You've survived the année folle without ever having to leave your bed.
The dust settles on the gilded mirror. So here we are, drifting into the final echoes of our story. If you're still awake, your mind is likely floating like a stray balloon over the rooftops of Paris,
caught in that slow, rhythmic breeze that only comes when the world has finally decided to be quiet. We have followed the white madness from its fashionable debut in the smoky jazz clubs to its eventual dusty demise in the silent salons. But before we let the curtain fall entirely, we must look at the afterlife of this era, the way the 1920s didn't just end, but rather evaporated, leaving a strange residue on the pages of history. Think about the year 1937. The roaring 20s were now ancient history to the youth of Paris. To a 20-year-old in 1937, a story about a white dinner in 1923 sounded as distant and ridiculous as a story about powdered wigs and minuet dancing. The world had become sharp, angular, and terrifyingly real. The irony is that the very people who spent the 20s trying to be modern were now the most outdated things in the city. They were like ghosts who had forgotten to vanish at dawn. Let's drift over to the great Parisian estate sales. By the late 30s, many of the families we've been talking about, the minor royals with major habits, were finally hitting rock bottom. This is where the dry humor of history gets a bit biting. You'd have an auction at a crumbling mansion near the Parc Monceau. The catalog would list priceless 18th century tapestries, a collection of Fabergé snuff boxes, and various silver medical implements. The people attending these auctions weren't the old aristocracy. They were the new middle class, the bankers and industrialists who had actually worked during the 20s. They bought the furniture of the addicts for a fraction of its value. There's something profoundly sarcastic about a hard-working insurance salesman sitting in a Louis XVI chair where a baron once sat and hallucinated that he was a butterfly. The physical world was being reclaimed by the sober people, while the lost generation simply dissolved. But what happened to the actual Habsburg potatoes monarchs we mentioned earlier, those displaced royals who had treated heroin like a birthright? Well, their end was often as flat and unceremonious as a skipped heartbeat. Many ended up in the pensiones of the French Riviera, cheap hotels for people with expensive names. They would spend their days sitting on the promenade, wearing suits that were 20 years out of fashion, watching the Mediterranean, and waiting for a check from a distant relative that would never arrive. They became a local curiosity. "Oh, that's the Grand Duke of somewhere or other," the locals would whisper. "He used to own half of Poland, but now he owns a very small dog and a very large collection of empty vials." They were the ultimate ironic contrast, the peak of human social hierarchy, reduced to a man wondering if he can afford a second cup of coffee. And then there's the medical legacy. The heroin craze essentially gave birth to the modern concept of the rehab clinic. Before the 1920s, if an elite person had a problem, they were indisposed or sent on a long holiday. By the end of the 30s, the medical establishment had realized that you couldn't just mountain air your way out of a chemical dependency. The clinics became more professional, more clinical, and sadly, more necessary. The joyful one had forced the world to grow up and face the dark side of its own chemistry. Let's float one last time toward the shadow artists. For every Jean Cocteau who turned his struggle into a masterpiece, there were 1,000 artists who left behind nothing but half-finished sketches and unread poems. These are the true lost members of the generation. Their work wasn't destroyed by critics. It was simply never finished because they were too busy staring at the ceiling. History is a library where the most interesting books are often the ones that were never written because the author was too comfortable in a haze. The irony is that we still romanticize this time. We see the photos of Kiki de Montparnasse or the portraits of Man Ray, and we think how exciting it must have been. We forget the smell of the damp walls in the nursing homes. We forget the shivering and the cold sweats in the middle of a July afternoon. We forget that for most of the people involved, the 1920s wasn't a roar, it was a long, expensive whimper. As we reach the final minutes of our monologue, I want you to feel the weight of that silence. The city of Paris is now under a different kind of shadow as the 1930s close. The white madness is a faded stain on a silk dress that's been tucked away in an attic. The characters of our story, the poets, the princesses, the half-baked potatoes, have all drifted off into the great sleep of history. There's a strange comfort in how quickly the world moves on. The most scandalous affair, the most expensive addiction, the most tragic downfall, eventually they all just become content for a sleepy historian to talk about on a Tuesday night. It's a flat, rhythmic cycle of human folly and historical forgetting. The lights of the 1920s are truly gone now. There is no more jazz, no more white dinners, no more medical consultations in the back of a taxi. There is only the quiet, steady breathing of a world that has moved on, and the soft, heavy feeling in your own limbs as you finally give in to the gravity of the night. You've survived the craze. You've seen the rise and the fall. And now, like the city itself after the party ended, it's time for you to just let go. The history is settled. The stories are told. The bed is warm, and the past is exactly where it belongs, behind your closed eyes.
Well, it seems we aren't quite finished drifting through the corridors of the past. If you're still with me, your mind is likely in that strange liminal space, the one where the distinction between a historical fact and a dream starts to blur into a soft, monochromatic haze. We've seen the rise, the peak, and the decay of the Parisian white madness. But now we must look at the silence that followed. This is the after-party of history, where the only sound left is the wind whistling through the broken windows of a once grand estate. By the late 1930s, the lost generation had truly found what they were looking for: oblivion. But for the survivors, the irony was that the world they had tried so hard to escape was now coming for them in a much more literal, violent way. As the drums of World War II began to beat across Europe, the indulgent, hazy world of the 1920s didn't just seem old, it seemed offensive. The heroine craze became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with the French Republic. It was the rot that the new, sterner politicians promised to cut out. Let's float over to the last of the dandies. You know the type, the men who had spent 15 years perfecting the art of the silk cravat and the casual nod. By 1939, these men were in their 50s, but they looked 80. They were the walking advertisements for the long-term effects of la joyeuse. Their skin had the texture of old parchment, and their eyes had a permanent, distant look, as if they were still trying to find that one specific chandelier crystal from a party in 1924. When the mobilization orders came, many of these former elites were found to be physically unfit for service. Now that sounds like a lucky break, doesn't it? But in the social climate of the time, it was the ultimate humiliation. To be told you were too fragile to defend your country because you'd spent a decade in a chemical fog was the final nail in the coffin of their social relevance. They weren't just addicts anymore, they were decadents, and decadent was the most dangerous thing you could be in 1940. The dry humor of the situation, if you have a particularly dark sense of humor, was how the black market shifted. During the 1920s, the black market was for luxury, for white powder and fine champagne. By 1941, during the occupation, the black market was for butter, coal, and bread. The former socialites who had once navigated the underworld of Montmartre to find their fix now found themselves using those same skills to find a single egg or a liter of kerosene. It was a brutal, ironic, downward mobility.
The skills they had acquired in the drug dens were finally being put to practical use, but for the most basic of human needs. Let's talk about the apartment ghosts. During the war, many of the grand apartments that had hosted the heroin salons were requisitioned or abandoned. There are stories of soldiers entering these dusty, boarded-up mansions and finding time capsules. They'd find a room perfectly preserved from 1926, a gramophone with a needle still on the record, empty vials of medical heroin scattered on a velvet rug, and a half-written poem on a desk. It was as if the occupants had just evaporated into the air. These rooms were the physical manifestation of the era's philosophy, a beautiful, expensive, and ultimately hollow shell. The soldiers didn't see the glamour or the artistic rebellion. They just saw a mess. They saw a group of people who had checked out of history long before history was finished with them. It's that sarcastic contrast again, the highest aspirations of soul-searching reduced to a cluttered room that needs a good sweeping. The irony of the Habsburg potato types we've discussed, the minor royalty, hit its tragic nadir during the war. Many of these displaced nobles, already weakened by years of addiction and poverty, simply didn't survive the hardships of the occupation. They died quietly in unheated rooms, their titles meaning nothing to the cold or the hunger. They were the casualties of a party that had ended 20 years prior, but they had just forgotten to leave the room. And what of the legacy? After the war ended in 1945, Paris tried to reinvent itself again. But this time there was no room for white madness. The city was focused on reconstruction, on existentialism, and on a new kind of intellectualism that was much more sober, or at least much more focused on coffee and cigarettes than on heavy narcotics. The 1920s were treated like a collective fever dream. People spoke about them with a shake of the head, as if describing a relative who made a very embarrassing scene at a wedding. The heroin craze left behind a very specific type of scar on French culture. It created a deep-seated suspicion of decadence in the ruling class. It's why, for decades afterward, the French elite were so obsessed with appearing serious and productive. They were running away from the image of the trembling, pale count in the silk pajamas. They had seen where that road led, and it led to a damp, gray Tuesday in 1940 when no one cared about your pedigree. As we reach the final minutes of this long, winding monologue, I want you to feel the stillness of the present. The 1920s are no longer a roaring memory. They are a layer of dust at the bottom of a drawer. The people we've talked about, the poets who died too young, the princesses who pawned their souls, the doctors who prescribed the fire to put out the spark, they are all at peace now. Their mistakes are just words in the air, a rhythmic lullaby to help you disconnect from your own world. History is a very long, very repetitive story of people trying to find a shortcut to happiness and finding a long road to nowhere instead. But there is a certain beauty in the nowhere. It's quiet there. It's dark. It's a place where you don't have to be modern or fashionable or elite. You just have to be. The city of Paris has long since moved on. The cafes have new owners, the salons have been turned into offices, and the white powder has been replaced by the mundane concerns of the 21st century. The ghosts of the années folles have finally stopped trying to get your attention. They've laid down their silk fans, they've put away their porcelain spoons, and they've finally, mercifully, fallen asleep. And so should you. The bed is warm, the room is dark. The story of the heroin craze is complete, and there are no more disasters to worry about tonight. Just the slow, steady pull of the night, and the comfort of knowing that the past is safely tucked away where it can't bother anyone else anymore.
The final dissolve and the silence of the archives. We've reached the very edge of the map now, haven't we?
that strange, quiet territory where the story stops being about people and starts being about the things they left behind. If you're still listening, your mind is likely drifting like a single leaf on the surface of the Seine, unhurried, heavy with the dampness of the night, and ready to finally sink into the dark. We've watched the white madness consume the youth, the talent, and the fortunes of a generation, but in this final chapter, we must watch it consume itself. This is the ultimate fate of any craze. It doesn't end with a bang. It just gets recycled into the background noise of time. Think about the Parisian lost property offices of the 1940s and 50s. There's something deeply dryly ironic about the physical leftovers of the heroine era. In those dusty drawers, you'd find silver-plated needles that had once belonged to marquises, tucked inside leather cases lined with velvet. You'd find tiny ornate snuff boxes that looked like they should hold a lock of hair from a royal lover, but instead held a faint, bitter residue that smelled like a hospital hallway. These objects, once the most important things in their owners' lives, were now just miscellaneous items. They had been stripped of their power to charm or destroy. They were just cold metal and old leather. The salon addicts we discussed, the ones who survived the war, eventually became the old guard of a world that didn't exist anymore. By the 1950s, you'd still see them occasionally at the opera or at a premiere, looking like they had been preserved in amber since 1925. They were the ones who still wore heavy, powdered makeup to hide the heroin hollows in their cheeks. They were walking museums of a decade that everyone else was trying to forget. They'd sit in the front row, nodding off not because of a substance, but because of age, their dreams still populated by the ghosts of jazz musicians and poets who had died before the radio was even a household staple. The dry humor of history lies in how these figures were treated by the new post-war intelligentsia. To the existentialists in their black turtlenecks, the 1920s elite weren't tragic heroes, they were just bourgeois relics. The white madness was seen as a lack of character, a failure to engage with the absurdity of existence. There is a certain sarcasm in being told you weren't deep enough by a 20-year-old in a cafe, especially after you'd spent a decade literally trying to dissolve your soul in a vial. The elites had gone from being the avant-garde to being out of touch, a transition that is perhaps the most painful thing a Parisian socialite can endure. Let's float over to the archive of the unseen. In the basements of the French medical institutes, there are folders full of reports from the 1920s, records of the social hygiene movement. These documents are filled with clinical, sarcastic observations about the heroin temperament. The doctors of the time, finally freed from the need to please their wealthy patients, wrote with a brutal honesty. They described the Habsburg potato types not as royals, but as biological dead ends. They documented how the joyful one had a way of flattening out the human personality until everyone, from the duke to the dock worker, looked and acted exactly the same. It was the ultimate unintended democracy, the democracy of the void. And what about the city itself? Paris has a way of absorbing its own tragedies. The heroin hotels were repainted. The nursing homes were turned into luxury apartments for a new generation of elites who preferred gin or, later, television. The smoky cafes of Montmartre were scrubbed clean and turned into tourist traps where you could buy a postcard of a flapper without ever knowing that the real girl in the photo died in a cold room with a needle in her arm. The glamour was preserved as a marketing tool, while the reality was swept under the rug like so much unwanted dust. The irony of our sleepless history is that the very things that make a story interesting to us now, the drama, the tragedy, the dark personal lives, were the very things that made those lives unlivable at the time. We find comfort in their disasters because they are far away and safely narrated in a monotone voice. We look at the heroine craze of 1920s Paris as a fascinating experiment in human limits, forgetting that for the people in the middle of it, it was just a very long, very boring Tuesday that never seemed to end. As we reach the final seconds of this 9-part monologue, I want you to feel the ultimate dissolve. Imagine the last vial of 1920s heroin being smashed in a gutter somewhere in 1944. Imagine the last salon queen taking her final breath in a quiet nursing home in 1960. The story is finally, truly over. The white madness has been diluted by decades of rain, by the noise of the metro, and by the sheer relentless forward motion of the world. There is nothing left to analyze, no more snarky asides to make, no more ironic contrasts to point out. The half-baked Habsburgs have all gone to ground. The poets have been anthologized or forgotten. The white dinners are just a footnote in a book about French gastronomy that no one reads anymore. The history is flat. The history is still. The history is, quite frankly, exhausted. The city of Paris is sleeping now, and for once it's not a chemical sleep. It's the sleep of a city that has seen it all, forgotten most of it, and decided that the present is quite enough to handle. The lost generation is no longer lost. They are just gone. And you, my friend, are safely here in the present, wrapped in the warmth of your own reality, far away from the damp, flickering lights of a century ago. The story is finished. The monologue has run its course. The heroine craze of 1920s Paris has been laid to rest, one word at a time. The air in your room is still. The night is complete. There is nothing left for you to do but let your thoughts drift away like the last notes of a jazz record, spinning slower and slower until the needle finally lifts and there is only the beautiful velvet silence of a deep and perfect sleep.